I guess Brexit was kind of a big deal, so if I was to say it was a defining part of my political philosophy, you probably wouldn't be that surprised. You might be surprised why though, especially if I were to reveal that I don't actually have any strong opinions about Brexit itself, except for that it should be pronounced Brexit and not Brexit. If you'd like to know my official stance, it's that maybe Brexit would work, maybe it wouldn't. If someone presented me a plan to revitalise the UK's economy and society and it involved leaving the EU, I wouldn't reject that out of hand. But the key word there is plan. It has to be part of a plan. There has to be some sort of vision for it. I don't know why people have turned Brexit into a yes-no question where you're either for or against it, because for me, obviously the main thing with Brexit is how we got there in the first place. So for those who don't know, David Cameron had a split within his party over some people who thought we should be in the EU and others who thought we shouldn't, but he wanted all of their votes. So basically he said, well, if you agree with me on most issues, but you're not sure about the EU, then vote for me in the general election because you agree with me on most issues, and then we'll have another vote just about whether we should be in the EU. It's not a terrible idea in principle. If there's two groups of people who agree on almost everything, but there's one issue that they can't agree on, it could be good to have a unified platform where part of that is that they'll then have a popular vote on the issue they disagree on. The thing is that David Cameron himself wasn't neutral on the Brexit issue. He was firmly pro-EU. So we ended up with a situation where in voting for Brexit, we were telling the government to do something that they thought was a fundamentally bad idea. In response to this, David Cameron resigned, and suddenly a lot of the Conservatives who had been cheering for Brexit didn't want to step up to the plate and actually realise this vision. Like literally nobody wanted to lead the UK and make Brexit happen, so the next woman who ended up taking over from David Cameron was also someone who was firmly against Brexit initially. And it wasn't until 3 years after we voted for Brexit that we finally got a Prime Minister who actually said that he himself thought Brexit was a good idea. And even then, based on his initial reluctance to take charge of the UK after David Cameron stepped down, it seems like deep down he probably didn't actually think it was a good idea. And then people ask me what my opinion on Brexit is, like as if I'm supposed to be for or against it. Well, all I have to say to that is that I'm against governments being forced to implement policies that they don't think will work out for the overall good of the country. Because even if these policies could have good results, are the governments that think these policies are terrible going to be able to actually deliver them? I remember seeing all the evidence of the markets tanking in the wake of the whole Brexit thing, and people were saying this proves that Brexit was a completely stupid idea and it's a total economic disaster. But again, maybe Brexit could have worked if there was some bold new plan of which Brexit was just some small part. But it's hardly surprising that the markets totally tanked when the government of the UK had spent the past few months saying, don't vote Brexit, Brexit will be a disaster, we're all going to die. And then they lost the vote and had to commit themselves to implementing the policy that they had just been saying would totally fail. I'm not some big economist with a fancy degree, but my understanding is that a lot of the economy is driven by trust and enthusiasm. When people trust and are enthused with the idea that things are going in the right direction, the economy will do well. If that's not the case, things will go very badly. Call me Nostradamus, but I could have predicted that the government saying, we're going to start doing something that we think will be absolutely terrible, is not going to inspire a lot of confidence. All of this is, by the way, why I'm against referendums for important matters in principle. Referendums should just be for mundane things like changing a flag. Or at least for something where the government genuinely has no opinion whatsoever and is completely happy to go with the consensus. But having a referendum where people can vote for a policy that the government has said they think is a bad idea is obviously stupid, because then you're basically voting for the people who think the policy is a bad idea to be in charge of implementing that policy. The other issue with referendums is that they totally undermine parliamentary sovereignty. If you don't know, that's basically what it sounds like. Each parliament is sovereign and can basically do whatever it wants to do. That's why I always hated the people who acted like parties talking about ignoring the referendum result were betraying British democracy. There was literally a newspaper calling the Supreme Court judges in the UK traitors because they said that Parliament had the authority to ignore the referendum result. Yes, of course, British democracy that's been around for hundreds of years and had parliamentary sovereignty as a core principle for almost as long would be totally destroyed if we didn't heed the results of a referendum. something that's been a feature of our democracy for not even 50 years. That grew to be the number one thing I hated about the Brexit debate, people acting like British democracy hung in the balance based on whether or not people respected the referendum result. I support parliamentary sovereignty, and therefore the only person with any sort of obligation to actually follow through on the referendum result was David Cameron, the person who called the referendum. As soon as he resigned, that's it. It doesn't matter. Why should a future government be bound to deliver on the results of a referendum they didn't call? I've since thought it would have been really funny to establish the satirical point about Parliamentary Sovereignty Party, or SPPSP for short. I wish I could have run as leader of that party in the 2017 and 2019 referendums with just one policy promise. Vote for us and we will have just one election day where voters will be given the option to vote directly on hundreds of policies. What should schools teach? Should we go to war with someone? How high should taxes be? What should be an MP's wage? Should we have a monarchy? And so on and so on. People would be able to just work their way through a list of different policy questions and tick whichever option they prefer. And then, at the end of that day, we would have a whole load of referendum results and we would immediately resign and let some other future government deal with delivering on the results of all those referendums. Because that's the precedent that's been set, right? It doesn't matter which government called the referendum or why they did it. From then on, every single future government is obligated to deliver on those results. And any party that's going to run on a policy of not delivering on the results of those referendums is anti-democratic and they are traitors to British democracy. Yep, this whole referendum as a cornerstone of British democracy thing is really stupid. But none of that was actually the big takeaway from the whole Brexit situation for me. That's just something that's annoyed me for a long time and I've been wanting to complain about it, and I finally had the opportunity. No, what stuck with me was a line that I heard from Brexit enthusiasts when it did seem like Brexit was causing a lot of economic hardship for the country. Can't we just pretend that it's World War II? You know, Germany during World War II, the definitive bad guys of world history, set on taking over all of Europe and then presumably the whole world. The British stood alone, defiant against them from 1940 to 1941, one whole year where we were the only people holding back the Nazi menace. But it wasn't easy, was it? We had to implement rationing, we had blackouts, collective bargaining was suppressed, people needed to work longer hours, and at the end of that they couldn't expect fair compensation. We had to up production even while most of our working age men were away fighting, and at the same time our factories were being bombed, hindering our ability to produce things in the first place. And also, not for nothing, people died, like 500,000 people died, 70,000 of them civilians killed on the home front by German bombing. But we endured it. We came out the other end. So it's not as if we're incapable of enduring hardship. And there it is. That's the political awakening I had in the wake of Brexit. The UK should be willing to endure a period of hardship where we tighten our belts, we work harder, and at the end of it we have less money in our pockets. That is why I support high taxes. That's the ultimate reason. Ever since I first heard somebody say, isn't it a good thing for the UK to endure some hardship to achieve a worthwhile goal? I've been thinking, yeah, you know what, actually, yeah, I reckon it is. Of course, the big question there is whether or not Brexit was a worthwhile goal. I mean, that's the funny thing in that context, right? We go through all this hardship to make Brexit work. We endure the market crash and the loss of jobs and the admittedly minor but nonetheless otherwise unnecessary annoyance of longer passport queues whenever entering the continent. And for what? Is there anything our country has achieved in the last 10 years that we wouldn't have been able to achieve were it not for Brexit? Some people say that our sovereignty alone was a price worth fighting for, but considering that we did have the option to leave, we were still sovereign. And talking about sovereignty's a little bit rich from the same people who turned into rabid dogs as soon as parliamentary sovereignty was affirmed as a foundational part of our constitution. It seems to me that at best, Brexit has been neutral. There's been no clear benefit to it. And in some ways, that's the biggest negative of it. Because I remember how much this was dominating the efforts of our politicians, how much time was spent trying to come up with a deal that worked. All the resources dedicated to working out some kind of effective compromise on the issue of Northern Ireland's borders. For a while, it seemed like it was the only thing anyone was talking about. And I just thought, man, surely all of that effort and anxiety and political political will could have been better spent achieving something else. I mean, even World War II, the original referent for this stiff upper lip, tighten your belt, lie back and think of England mentality, wasn't actually a good thing for the UK. Sure, it was better than the alternative, but everything that we lost and all we endured in that war was just in service of trying to minimize the damage of a horrible situation. We entered World War II a global superpower and we left it not. Isn't it interesting that for as much as a lot of people would agree that this country should be able to come together and be willing to endure hardship for some greater good, the greater good often being pursued is something we only seek to strive for when we're in such a terrible situation already that even the greatest possible good could only see us breaking even. See, here's a thought experiment. What if I, the hero of this tale, decided to come out as Prime Minister and say to everyone, hey, I've got some news, we're at war with this country called East Asia. In fact, we've always been at war with them. And sure, our noble, loyal allies in Eurasia have been on our side this entire time, but they're demanding even more commitment from us. So what we're going to do is everyone's going to work longer hours and we're going to have higher taxes, so you might have a little less, but you know what? It's all for the righteous war effort. And sure, it might get hard, but the fact of the matter is we've been in this war with our enemies, Eurasia, forever. And if we don't come to the aid of our ever faithful allies, East Asia, we could face an existential threat. And basically, through this appeal, we were able to do what the Brexiteers wanted: commit as many resources to this valiant struggle as we did to World War II. Except, what if I came out and I was like, all right, everyone, I've got a confession. April Fools. There wasn't really a war, we were just making it up. I mean, I guess people might not see the funny side of the joke at first. There might be real grumpy stumpies about it. But what if I was like, hey, remember all of that tax money we collected? How you guys were willing to work extra hard, even while paying extra tax so the government could collect lots of revenue? And you were willing to do that because you thought it was going to go towards killing people in foreign lands. Well, guess what? That's not what we used it for. Actually, we have just collected all of that money generated from our near total mobilization of the entire British economy towards achieving the ultimate end of fixing all our domestic issues. So now we can actually use that money not only to keep our heads above water in a disaster like a war or, for example, a global pandemic. Instead, we can actually use all of that money now to fix all of the problems we just ordinarily have in this country and get ahead of the next disaster. So yeah, that's kind of what I mean when I say I'm pro high tax. That when this country is facing an existential crisis, it's imperative that we all come together. And in war, that means people being willing to sacrifice their lives or endure our cities being bombed. The good news is, if we're not talking about a war, we don't have to worry about sacrificing any lives on the battlefield. No, the crisis we have right now is the crisis of mediocrity, and that is just as much an existential threat to the UK as any war could possibly be. I don't even need to elaborate on what I mean by that. So many people right now hate this country and its institutions because the system has let them down so monumentally. But the good thing about this crisis is that tackling it will save far more lives than it will cost. In fact, it shouldn't really cost any lives. But people still do need to be willing to come together to endure hardship just as we had to endure for every other existential crisis our country has faced. Except this time, they don't have to worry about sacrificing lives, just sacrificing money. And I think I'm being pretty logical in saying that when we have an existential crisis, we need to make those sacrifices. It shouldn't even be a debate. If our country was at war, I'd say, well, we need to do something about this, right? And whatever we're going to do is going to have to be a collective effort that demands something from all of us. Right now, I feel like our country might as well be at war when you look at the state it's in, and if we're talking about a collective effort where something is demanded of all of us, well, that's just literally high taxes, right? So really, you either support high taxes or you support complacency and passivity in the face of decline. Make your choice. Now, to be fair, there are some who think we can solve the problems our country faces by decreasing the amount our government does. In the UK, this has been seen through a policy called austerity. Austerity was basically when the Conservative government said, we are going to try to restrict government spending to be as little as possible. And you'd be shocked to hear that the government saying their plan was to basically do as close to nothing as possible didn't actually solve any of the problems. I didn't really have any economic opinions when the Conservatives first came to power in 2010, but I have always based my political beliefs on evidence, and what the evidence shows makes sense. So inevitably, in following the evidence, you can only come to the conclusion that austerity doesn't work. Because at first they were like, all right, we'll contract government spending loads, and that will reduce waste, and it will give people more money, and that will fix the economy. And in just a few years, we'll no longer be running a budget deficit, and everything will be fixed. And then the timeline kept getting pushed back and back and back, and now it's 2025, and I recently heard someone say that life in the UK still feels like it hasn't recovered from the 2007 recession and I honestly couldn't disagree. I mean, the big financial disaster before then was Black Wednesday in 1992, and I don't think anyone could honestly claim we're still living in a post-Black Wednesday world. In fact, the late 90s were actually very good for the UK economically, so there was a very clear, there was a problem, we recovered, we moved on distinction. But since 2007, has there been a single moment where you could say, we've recovered? Like, obviously I realize that all of history affects the present, but we're not in the same continuous crisis since 1992 because there was an obvious period of recovery. Since 2007, there hasn't been a single obvious period of recovery, so we really are just in the same continuous crisis that we've been in for the last 18 years. Yes, it was made worse by Brexit and COVID and Ukraine and Trump's tariffs, but the earliest of those things was Brexit in 2016, which means there was still 8 years of continuous crisis before then, during which we were promised recovery. And the reason we didn't get that recovery is because austerity doesn't work. The government spending less doesn't fix the economy. When a ship is in trouble, it needs a captain, and that captain needs to commit resources to fixing the problem. If people ask me what my economic policy is in one word, I'd insist on giving them two: tax and spend. I guess if I was forced to put it down to one word though, it would be invest. When the government has a plan and they collect money to realize that plan, that is investing. I want to live in a country where the government is constantly investing in that country and introducing money to pursue new things. See, the thing about investing is that you get a return on investing. This is why I'm not a huge fan of the idea that we should just increase deficit spending so we get the best of both worlds. Lots of spending and low taxes. The problem is, one obvious example of how high taxes in the long run pays for itself is that one of the things we could be spending money on is paying off the debt. Because did you know that we spend £107 billion a year just paying off the interest on our debt? That's 8.7% of the money you pay for tax. That's 3.9% of our GDP. Now, sure, in order to gain access to that £107 billion we're currently spending on interest, we would have to pay off all of our £2.7 trillion that we are currently in debt. So that might not be the best return on investment, spending £2.7 trillion to get £107 billion. But it's just a really easy example to understand this principle of taxation being ultimately an investment in the future of the country. You get taxed a bit more, you tighten your belt, you go without a few luxuries, you have less money to throw around, but at the end of it all, we have £107 billion more each year to spend. That's called investing. You spend a little to make a little. But if you're willing to get a bit less direct, we have opportunities like this everywhere. We don't spend money fixing cracks in the road so they turn into potholes. Not only does that mean they're now going to be way more expensive to fix once the government gets round to it, but in the meantime they are damaging people's cars, and that's a massive waste of money. We don't spend enough money hiring good doctors, so we have to rely on cheap foreign labour, and then we have to spend money accommodating a large population of immigrants. We don't invest in education, which is another reason why we need immigration to fill gaps in our labour force, and also it leads to antisocial behaviour, which costs money directly, and requires more policing, which costs money. But we don't spend that money on policing, meaning that crime goes undetected, which means more social and economic destruction from criminal vices. I could go on. The fact is, you can point to pretty much any area where the government is choosing not to spend money and show how in the long run that is actually costing us a lot more money. So I think, why not be the next greatest generation? Why do we call the working adults during World War II the greatest generation? Because they worked hard and they didn't get much out of it personally, but they achieved something for future generations and saved the country overall from an existential threat. If we could endure something like they did, we could get a handle on society's problems instead of just treading water to keep our head above the surface and putting off actually fixing the root cause of the problems until it's too late. And I will just point out that fixing these problems necessarily requires spending money. A lot of people seem to have somehow managed to convince themselves that this could possibly not be the case. Here's a pop quiz, see how you do. Question 1. The UK has a failing national health service with growing waiting lists and declining quality, leading to an increase in deaths at hospitals. What's the solution to this problem? A. Wait for the second coming of Christ to start walking around and miraculously healing people. B. Return to the Black Death days and just throw out our dying onto wheelbarrows to be taken out of town. C. Spend more public funds to recruit more and better quality doctors. Lock in your answers now. Question 2. The UK is facing a crisis in policing and overcrowded prisons with rising crime rates and dangerously packed facilities that make rehabilitation almost impossible. What's the solution? A. Just, Legalize paedophilia. I mean, we can't arrest everyone at the BBC, can we? B. Introduce a Hunger Games system where the last prisoner standing wins parole. C. Increase public spending to hire more police officers and increase capacity in our prisons. Question 3. Britain's education system is falling apart. Schools are crumbling, teachers are burning out, and students are falling into lives of antisocial degeneracy. What should we do? A. Let corporations take over our classrooms and advertise their products to students, like that episode of The Simpsons.
Now turn to the next problem. If you have 3 Pepsis and drink 1, how much more refreshed are you? You, the redhead in the Chicago school system?
Pepsi?
Partial credit.
B. Bring in motivational speakers like Lily Phillips and Belle Delphine to encourage kids to find less education-oriented ways of becoming rich and famous. C. Fund schools properly so they can pay teachers well, reduce class sizes, and update materials and facilities. Alright, so that was actually a pretty tough one. Don't be upset if you get the wrong answers in the comments. I can understand a lot of people think that, hey, who's to say what the solution is here? Anyway, one more question. Question 4. UK public infrastructure, especially water and rail, is broken. Trains are late, rivers are full of sewage, and yet prices go up every year. How do we fix this? A. Turn the rail companies into roller coasters, Disneyland style. People will be willing to pay Disneyland prices if they get to do a few sick-ass loop-de-loops on their way into King's Cross. B. Just go back to the days when we drank beer because that's the only thing we could trust wasn't poisoned, and it's not that different from what a lot of Brits are doing today anyway. C. Pay the money to renationalise these services and commit to modernising infrastructure and making public services work for the public. How did you do? Well, just on the off chance you maybe realise that actually the only way to solve these problems is for the government to spend more money to fix them. I do have one quick follow-up question. What is the best way for our government to collect money to spend without putting our children further into debt? That's why I support high taxes. Now, I suppose I should address some objections. I'll be honest, I don't expect this video to serve as a conclusive argument for my position. This is more me expressing where I'm coming from politically rather than actually trying to change anyone else's mind. So I'm not going to address every possible objection here, but I will just point out a few of the things that immediately jumped out to me. The first point is that some people might say, well, we don't need to spend more money on public services. We just need to work on making those public services more efficient. That Doge. Get that Doge coin. The first issue here is that absolute efficiency is impossible and can as such be used as an excuse to put off increasing public spending indefinitely. You can always argue that public services that take care of millions of people aren't perfectly efficient, but that's not a realistic goal. What I would point out though is that Americans spend twice as much money on healthcare as the Brits do. Now, I would say that the American healthcare system is slightly better if you can afford it, but it's not twice as good. So logically, I think you could increase spending in the British system to bring it on par with the American system in terms of quality, while it would still cost a lot less. And to me, the same quality for less money sounds like efficiency. The issue is right now, I would advise Americans not to move to the UK, because our healthcare system is awful. Not because it's inefficient, but because it's underfunded. Healthcare is the best example of how this toxic aversion to high taxation in the Anglosphere is literally suicidal. Like, Americans will pay 20% of their income on health insurance that still ultimately ends up screwing them over. Brits could pay much less for a system that's much fairer, and we actively choose to sabotage it by voting for parties that promise low taxes. Well, low taxes means less funding, which means less quality. Efficiency can only take you so far until you're at a point where you're just asking medical professionals to do more with resources that simply aren't there. The NHS is a really interesting example here because yes, it absolutely is more efficient than a privatized model. And the reason for that is that the state has more bargaining power. It's also much easier to organize things when you just have one entity in charge of everything and you don't have to go through all of these different service providers and fill out all of this paperwork to make sure that you've dotted the I's and crossed the T's for all the insurance details. Government services are almost always highly efficient. Railways are another great example of that. The British government spends more money on the railways now that they're privatized because they keep having to bail out the companies with subsidies than they ever did when they were just controlling the railways directly. The real kicker is that some of the private companies that profit off our privatized railways are literally managed by the nationalized rail services of other countries. So yeah, if the railways were nationalized and ran by the government, they would be a lot cheaper, but maybe some of the cost would be paid in taxes, and people seem to not like that. But why? If you're getting a better service for less money, how is it an issue if you're paying that through taxation instead of on demand? The way I look at it is that the government is like a middleman who can get you the best deals on infrastructure and healthcare. So if you have a guy who can get you the best for your money, wouldn't you just logically want to give that guy as much money as possible? Like, if I knew a guy who said he could get me a house for half the money it would cost an American, wouldn't I want to give that guy as much money as possible so I could get the most out of this deal? So yeah, this whole efficiency thing to me seems really stupid and based on a totally false premise. I'm not claiming that there are no inefficiencies when the government runs things, but I'm just saying both logically and in practice, it seems like government-run services tend to be much more efficient than those in the private sector. Also, a very obvious point here, an obsession with efficiency can easily become inefficient, right? Like, this is a common reality, right? Someone spends a huge amount of time organizing their schedule so they can use their time as efficiently as possible, when in reality, the time they wasted putting together that schedule actually has made them less efficient. If we have a whole load of efficiency experts who are analyzing every single nook and cranny of the NHS's operations, I think we'll find at the end of it that the biggest waste of money there was the money spent hiring these efficiency experts. And the final point I'd make in this regard is that absolute efficiency is, in my submission, actually a bad thing. I mean, think about what we actually mean when we say absolute efficiency. What we mean is nothing that isn't absolutely necessary. Doesn't that just sound soulless and joyless? This is one of my big issues with Doge as an organization. They're not actually about efficiency, they're about identifying things that the administration thinks is unnecessary and getting rid of those. Well, alright, so no Christmas lights put up by the council, no beautiful government buildings, no field trips for school children. I mean, is that absolutely necessary? Honestly, call me crazy, but even if absolute efficiency was possible, I wouldn't want it. I don't want to live in a world where people are only ever doing exactly what they need to do at any given time, and there is never a moment where any resources are dedicated to the redundant and the ridiculous. No, I think we should allow for and expect and rejoice in the possibility that sometimes money will go to things that's kind of frivolous, that we don't really need to be spending money on. I mean, I actually think one of the big losses of liberal democracy is with the government being accountable to the general public came the idea that the government always has to be totally responsible with how they manage our money. Do you know why we don't have the Great Pyramids or those awesome medieval cathedrals anymore? Because those things were frivolous, they were extravagant, and they were made by a regime that didn't have to justify every single awesome thing they did as maximally efficient. So as far as I'm concerned, rather than pursuing maximum efficiency as a way to solve the issue of a lack of government spending without having to increase taxes, I'd actually say that we should increase taxes so there's a bit of leeway for inefficiency every now and then, because we're human beings, not robots. The next thing I want to address is the people who say, well, the government spends money on evil things and I don't want to be a part of that. The best example of this would be war. The government spends money on war, so why would we want our money to be going towards that? The other thing you could point out is that tax money often goes to corruption too, but I'd say that this is actually a reason we should have higher taxes. Because by discouraging political parties from pursuing policies with higher taxes, you are discouraging them from making a positive case about all of the good things that tax money could be used for. If you make the concept of government revenue a dirty, intrinsically suspect concept, you're actually creating a situation where that revenue is more likely to be used for those dirty suspect ends. And it always will be. If this concern was valid, that higher taxes mean the government spending more money on evil things, then logically if we had lower taxes, the government would spend less money on those evil things. But as has rightly become a saying in recent years, there's always money for war. We've seen so many social services get cut, and yet money to be sent overseas to fund wars seems to be available on demand. So by saying that you want lower taxes because you're mad about the money the government has been spending on wars, you're kind of cutting off your nose to spite your face. Because all the bad stuff the government does, they're going to keep on doing. The stuff they're going to cut is the stuff that benefits you. And like I say, I actually think a message that is more pro-high tax would stop the government from spending money on evil things. Because if we reframed tax and government revenue as a good thing, that would make it much harder for the government to justify doing evil things with it. I mean, the obvious example here as a point of comparison would be to, like the Middle Ages.
Our government official raised taxes from 1.4 to 1.6%, so we killed him and his entire family and then ate them. I mean, 1.6%? You fucking kidding me? Yeah, crazy.
I mean, there are some ways that the life of a medieval peasant was better than our lives now. They had more days off, their working day was less regimented. There's a whole video about this, which I will actually link in the description because it's definitely worth a watch. Oh, while I'm mentioning linking to things, I should say that this video is actually the middle part of a trilogy about my broader economic philosophy. So I will link to the first part now in the up here thing, and hopefully I will remember when the third video goes up to link that around here as well, and it will also be linked at the end of the video. But here's the thing, okay, yes, taxes were much lower in the Middle Ages, but that's because the government didn't provide anything like as many services. And I would say that what matters much more is not that the taxes were low, but that the taxes were going to the two big evil things that everyone complains about now. It went to further enriching the already rich elite and to funding wars. And by the way, a lot of corrupt countries in the modern world have really low tax rates because it's easy to have low tax rates when you're not trying to help millions of people, but just a handful of corrupt politicians and businessmen. Low tax rates are a stronger indication that the tax policy is to the benefit of the wealthy elite, as opposed to a high tax rate, which would be necessitated by if you're actually trying to help the common man. Like, even the most corrupt politicians and kings wouldn't dare to tax the population hundreds of billions of pounds because that's manifestly unnecessary if they're just trying to line their own pockets. But do you know what you do need hundreds of billions of pounds for? Improving a country where 65 million people live. So if there are two politicians on stage and they're asked, how much money should the government be bringing in revenue? I'm way more suspicious of the politician who says, a few million quid should do the trick, than I am of the politician who says, I'm going to be taxing people loads because we need hundreds of billions of pounds to make this country better. Because the first guy sounds like he's trying to make his corruption as painless as possible while still getting away with it and helping out all his cronies. While the second guy sounds like he actually has a plan to use that government revenue to do some good for the country. And this is my problem with that old Robin Hood guy, because what does he do that makes him such a hero? He steals taxes. Who are the bad guys in the Bible? The worst of the worst. The tax collectors. But here's the thing, right? The reason why people hated taxes so much back then is because there wasn't really a social net. The taxes weren't being used for some noble aim. I mean, I know that Rome had the grain subsidies for the poor and stuff, but they certainly didn't have anything like the welfare state we have now. But despite the fact that we're living in a very different world right now, a lot of people seem to think of taxes as if we've still got King John sat in his castle counting golden coins that he's stolen from starving peasants. And I suppose there's one final point I should say here, especially in consideration of the libertarians. See, something I often see from the stagnant swamp that is libertarian economic thought is that the problem with taxation is that the government has no incentive to reduce costs. Because if you have a private sector, people need to voluntarily pay for these services, so they need to reduce costs as much as possible in order to have competitive prices. But, so the logic goes, the government can just force people to purchase their services with taxation, so they have no incentive to keep prices low. But the issue of that is that governments manifestly don't want to increase people's taxes. They avoid it like the plague. If everything was nationalised and run by the government, parties would have a massive incentive to try to come up with ways to keep costs low, so they could say, vote for us, we'll continue giving you the same services and you'll pay less in tax. So yeah, libertarians are just wrong when they say governments don't have an incentive to keep costs low. We live in a democracy, they need people to vote for them. And the incentives at play here is another reason why I'm against high taxes. I am generally opposed to the establishment elite. What the establishment elite support is typically what I am in opposition to. And what I see from the media and from the political class is a consistent push for low taxes, and certainly never to raise them. And honestly, a pretty good rule of thumb for our society where we have so many problems is whatever the people at the top are pushing for, that's probably the exact opposite of what we should be doing. It's more transgressive to say that you want high taxes than low, because it's super easy for the government to just say, we'll cut taxes. I mean, think about it. That means cutting government services. That means the government doing less for its citizens. Why wouldn't a corrupt politician just agree to do that? It's less work while providing an easy, simplistic solution to the masses, and history shows that the lower taxes are, the higher proportion of that is going to the rich, elite and powerful. Another big part of my political awakening was the 2017 and 2019 runs of Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister. He was offering a policy that promised no tax increases for the majority of earners, and yet still a huge amount of public spending. Well, how can you make that work? One thing you could do is lie, or maybe to be fair, just be a little bit manipulative with the truth. Significantly, he wanted to get rid of of tax breaks for married couples, and he said, well, this isn't increasing the tax on married couples, it's just getting rid of a tax benefit that they used to have. Now, there are a few things that stand out to me about this. Firstly, that Jeremy Corbyn, the most left-wing leader of any mainstream UK party in my lifetime, was still afraid to say that he actually just wanted to increase taxes. Even left-wing politicians play this game of trying to assure people that their taxes aren't going to increase. Secondly, it bothers me that in order to try to claim you haven't raised taxes, politicians will try to get rid of tax breaks. But the problem is, usually we have tax breaks for things we want to encourage because they're good. Marriage is good. It's a foundation of society. More people should be getting married, and those who get married should get tax breaks. But the bigger issue here is, well, clearly this is dishonest, right? Doesn't this strike you as dishonest? If you're a married person earning a middle-class income and you hear Jeremy Corbyn say he isn't going to increase your taxes, you would probably think, well, if he's in charge, I guess my taxes aren't going to increase then. So when you find out that actually you're going to lose the tax breaks that you got based on getting married, and as such your taxes are going to increase, you might think that Jeremy Corbyn was a little bit of a liar when he said they wouldn't. One reason why I support high taxes and would be inclined to vote for a party that promises they are going to increase taxes is that I think politicians should be honest. And let's be real here, if you have a politician talking openly and unapologetically about how he's going to raise people's taxes, that right there is definitely an honest politician. If a politician says, we're not going to increase taxes, but we're going to improve this country by tackling inefficiency, maybe he's being honest. I suspect he's not. But if a politician comes out and says, this country is in the toilet right now, we've got a whole load of problems, and the only way to fix these problems is to invest in this country, and that means huge amounts of taxes, we are going to tax you, it's going to get uncomfortable, you're not going to like it. You couldn't hope for a more honest politician right now than that guy. And if he's being honest about the tax burden, it would make sense that he's maybe being honest about his plans to actually fix the country. Now, someone might say, well, isn't that logic kind of perverse? Like if a politician said, I'm going to introduce torture for puppies, I'd be a bit silly saying, well, he's clearly very honest, we should vote for him. No, I think that the best rhetoric a politician could espouse would be something that is on the surface unpopular and likely to not be received well by many people, because then it's clear that he's not just playing to the crowd. But even though it might not be popular, it's quite easy to understand how actually in the long run it could be doing people a lot of good. And high taxes is probably the best example of that. It's something that nobody wants to hear. It's not something you just say to appease the crowd, but maybe you're trusting that by taking the effort to explain what your actual plan is and making people realize that by investing in this country, we could make things better in the long run, you will actually win people over. Doing what I do ordinarily on this channel, I think I have a knack for being able to identify dishonest snake oil salesmen who are pushing a faulty ideology through falsehood. And as such, that's not the kind of thing I'd want to vote for in a politician, and I'm inclined to trust my gut when I consider what's the kind of thing a politician would have to say for me to realize that he's not like that he's actually honest. One point where I depart from the mainstream left is that something you'll often hear from them is, we're not going to raise taxes on the middle class, we're not even going to raise taxes on the lower half of the upper class, we're only going to be raising taxes on the super rich. We need to tax the 1%. Sometimes they won't even claim that they're going to increase taxes on the 1%, they'll just say, we need to close the loopholes to enforce the taxes we already have. Now honestly, I'm not sure if that's true. Maybe it is the case that we could genuinely fix all the problems in society just by getting the super rich to pay their fair share in such a way that nobody feels the squeeze of increased taxation. I have two problems though. Firstly, I think most people won't believe it. I think it sounds too good to be true. We're going to fund all of these public services and make them incredibly high quality for 65 million people, and that requires us to just tax a handful of people slightly more. Again, one huge issue of society is a lack of honesty and a lack of expectation of honesty. I don't know whether it's actually true that Bernie Sanders switched from complaining about millionaires to then just complaining about billionaires once it became known that he himself was a millionaire, but what's certainly true is that he pushed this idea that the financial responsibility for fixing all of the problems in society could be imposed on just a handful of very rich people. And I don't think that's right. And that's for one simple reason. Not that I think it's economically necessary to raise taxes on everyone, but that I think it is socially, culturally, politically, and even spiritually necessary. Because we are an ever more selfish society right now. So the worst thing a politician could say is that we are going to fix the problems in this society, and here's the good news, it won't require any sacrifice from you. I realize there are some people who earn terrible wages, and even though they're working incredibly hard, they're just barely surviving paycheck paycheck to paycheck and probably not even really surviving. These are people who you literally couldn't squeeze anything out of, the poorest of the poor. But in principle, I wish it were possible to impose at least some sort of nominal tax on everyone. Like maybe institute universal basic income just so we can tax it back from the really poor people. And the reason I say that is because I feel like everyone should be able to feel that they have something to give to make this country better. It's a real sickness that people are going to the voting booths and presumably on some level thinking that they want society to be better. Like that's why they're casting their vote, to improve society. But also a lot of people are thinking, and I want this to cost me as little as possible. How can our country ever possibly improve when that's the mentality a lot of people have? Honestly, if I was running to be Prime Minister, here's one thing you'd probably hear from me a lot. Please don't vote for me. If you're thinking, well, this guy's promising some really good stuff, but he's asking an awful lot of me, and I'm not willing to give that. I just want my life to be perfect and comfortable and not have to sacrifice anything. Don't vote for me. If your top priority is minimizing the amount that you have to give, then I wouldn't want you to vote for me. I wouldn't want you to be part of improving society, because mentally you stand in exact opposition to everything that makes societies great. Part of this comes from the fact I'm a Christian. One of the big features of the Gospels especially is self-emptying love, the willingness to give up everything for a righteous cause. Obviously, Jesus makes a big deal of saying you need to be willing to give up everything, and certainly at least a comfortable life, if you want to be part of realizing his kingdom on earth. Disclaimer, we are saved by faith apart from works. In order to be a saved Christian, you do not have to do anything that relates to works. You don't have to be willing to give anything up. You don't have to be willing to do certain good deeds. You certainly don't need to actually stop doing evil things or start doing good things. You are saved entirely by the completed works of Christ. Bringing Christ's kingdom down to earth is a works-based thing, but you don't have to be doing that in order to be a saved Christian. You can have a totally dead faith where you're not doing any works and you are still saved in Christ. I just wanted to take that moment to repudiate any notion of works-based salvation, because there is no salvation in works-based salvation. With that said, if what we're talking about is making the world a better place for the sake of the world, well yeah, that definitely is something that requires a huge amount of self-sacrifice. I don't really want a political message that's all about how billionaires should sell their second private jet. No, I want to talk about how middle class people should sell that second car, forego that fancy holiday, how working class people should cancel that Netflix subscription. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about how Elijah prayed that for 3 years it wouldn't rain upon the kingdom of Israel because the society had become so wicked. And then I think about the Christians I know who say, well, I just vote for whichever party I think will improve the economy. And I'm just thinking, do these people see our society? Do they look at it and say, yeah, this is a society that deserves a good economy? I mean, look at our attitudes towards sex, towards violence, towards the poor. Look at the people binging drugs and alcohol. Look at how we're failing to take care of the elderly and leaving a terrible future for our children. Yeah, I'm going to go to the polling place and make sure that I cast my vote so that this country has a good economy. Now, obviously, I think there's another reason people should be willing to endure hardship in order to actually bring in some taxes to, in the long run, make things better. It's not just purely an act of atonement. But if that means that people have to forego some luxuries and have a life that's slightly more rough, I'm not convinced that's a bug more so than a feature. Now, that maybe sounded a bit puritanical, and to be fair, a lot of my politics is very 17th century England, but it's not all doom and gloom. After all, if you cast your mind back, I pointed out that every single problem that we spend money to solve, in the long run, frees up more money for us to have in the future. And this is when I circle back to the other lesson that I learned from the whole Brexit thing. Remember what I said? The big problem with Brexit is that people didn't believe in it. They didn't think it was going to work, and the economy is very sensitive to public sentiment. What does that mean? Well, it means that even if someone has a really great plan to fix the UK economy, but that message is delivered with, and it won't demand anything of you, then it doesn't really require the people to actually believe in it. And therefore it probably won't succeed. But imagine if a politician comes out and says, I have a plan, and this plan is going to require you to forego luxuries and work harder and struggle to even keep your head above water because there's going to be such a financial burden on you. And then people actually voted for that. Wouldn't that guarantee that those people are actually enthusiastic and committed to making this vision work? Well, if they're so enthused that they're willing to vote to pay for more taxes, then they're unlikely to not show that enthusiasm in other ways. I've actually said before that I think any radical political philosophy would improve the UK at least somewhat initially. communism, fascism, even hardcore libertarianism. Because such an ideology being adopted would suggest a radical change in the attitudes of the British people, and that radical change is likely to bring with it radical enthusiasm. Well, what could be more radical in our neoliberal individualist world than loads of people saying that they actually want to pay more tax to contribute to a collective good? The UK doesn't have small problems, it has big problems, and big problems require radical solutions. We're not going to achieve a radical solution unless we can sell the British population on some fundamental change in mindset. So why do I support high taxes? Well, because I genuinely don't see the UK getting improved any other way. Nothing else could better communicate that the UK now has a renewed enthusiasm for making the country better, for turning it around. And the day after the majority of people vote for a party that's explicitly promising high taxes, what are they going to do? Are they going to do drugs? Are they going to commit crimes? Are they going to slack off at work? Unlikely. The reason why the UK is so bad is because people are voting for parties that they think will do the least damage possible while demanding the least of them. And if that's the attitude they have when it comes to who should be in charge of the entire country, why should we expect them to deviate from that attitude in every other aspect of their lives? Do the least damage possible while being demanded from as little as possible? What a great attitude to have to your family, to your work, to your lifestyle. High taxes suggest a willingness to commit to society that would reverberate out across people's lifestyles, ensuring that positive change comes from the ground up. I suppose I should address one question. Wouldn't it be better if the money was willingly given? And yeah, that is true if it relates to the virtue of sacrifice for the greater good. That is better if it's voluntary. And on that note, I will thank those who contribute to my channel by giving on Patreon. You're all tremendously appreciated. But a big issue of society right now is individualism, and being concerned about everything being voluntary only contributes to that. What we need is everyone to come together and collectivize a lot more, and that has to be imposed collectively. But this is a good way to transition to some broader benefits of a high tax society, and one of those is that we could completely do away with charity. My view is that charity should only exist to deal with incredibly niche issues, nothing important. The fact we have charities for curing deadly and life-threatening diseases, rescuing people from disasters, feeding children, that is evil in my view. Because, well, that suggests that the government isn't doing enough to deal with those issues themselves. Also, charity is kind of an intrinsically unfair system, right? Because we usually say that people should be rewarded for doing good. That's like how meritocracy works. But with charity, the better you are as a person, the less you're rewarded. If every issue completely relied on charitable contributions, then the most selfish people who care the least about others would be the best off. That's why I say that charity should be for frivolous things where it doesn't really matter who's the one contributing, whether they're rich or poor. The big benefit of taxation over charity is that it's forced on people, which means no money has to be wasted trying to convince people to give, nor do charities have to compete with each other. I refuse to give any money to a charity that I see advertising stuff, because that's just a waste of money. You're spending money that people are giving you to try to convince more people to give you more money. Instead, I think that we should have high enough taxes that the government can deal with all of the problems we have in society, the serious problems, such that the charities aren't necessary, and at most they should just function as the organizations to which the government gives the money so they can fix the issue. And it should be absolutely illegal for any charitable organization to spend money on advertising, because that's a waste of money. High taxes means it would be unnecessary for charities to put leaflets through your door, because the government would be taking the money from you automatically, and then the charities could just appeal to the government to get funding from them. Speaking of not spending money on advertising, a high tax society would actually mean less advertising. Right now, our society is absolutely plastered in adverts trying to get you to buy stuff. A lot of these adverts are on things that could be or are already publicly owned. Stadiums and arenas, public transport, public television. Working backwards through those, the BBC has no advert because it's publicly funded, but there are other TV channels that rely on adverts. What if all of them were publicly funded? Then we wouldn't have to have any adverts on the TV, no more commercial breaks. Public transport is funded by adverts because even though the government is often funding the public transport, they then have the adverts to recuperate some of that funding. If we had higher taxes, they wouldn't need to recuperate the money, which would mean we wouldn't need adverts on all of the buses and trains. And then for stadiums and arenas, they could be funded by public grants rather than privately owned. We wouldn't have to have the sportsdirect.com arena. And the end result of that would be a society with far fewer and perhaps even none of the constant bombard of adverts that plague the Western world. People would come to view the UK as an idealistic wonderland that escaped the consumerist hellhole of modernity. And consumerism is the key word there. In some sense, adverts don't actually bother me personally because I'm very good at ignoring them. I don't buy things just because something told me to. But then I realized, well, there must be a reason why these companies spend so much money on advertising, and that reality is so uncomfortable I find it existentially horrifying. There is presumably a significant proportion of people who genuinely do just mindlessly consume things because adverts tell them to. And to consider the fact that I live among such people is a horror of Lovecraftian proportions. But at least we can stop that NPC behavior manifesting by getting rid of the adverts, and as such stop the needless waste that comes from people consuming things they don't actually need. And getting rid of all the wasted money and man hours on not only producing that marketing material, but then accommodating the increase in consumption that material generates would be huge. I know this will surprise approximately 0 of you, but I would consider myself an anti-consumerist. And this relates to another positive of high taxation, which is I would like to pursue a policy of aggressive deflation. See, look, I'm not an economist, but I'm pretty sure everything I'm about to say in the next few minutes is correct. Inflation drives growth, because if the money in your pocket will be worth less next month, then you might as well spend it on something now, or at least invest it in something that will accrue value. What you definitely don't want to do is just hang on to your money and watch it slowly become worth a fraction of what it once was. Hence, inflation encourages you to do something with your money, hence inflation encourages growth. The problem is that inflation is effectively a flat tax rate, which is bad. Inflation is how more money is put into the economy, so it's essentially a source of government revenue. But this new money then decreases the value of existing money, and it decreases the value of people's money equally. So it's a flat tax rate. Despite people's wildly differing amounts of money, everyone has the exact same proportion of money taken away from them. The person living paycheck to paycheck struggling to make ends meet has their £10 decrease in value just as much as a billionaire. And that's why we should want to pursue deflation instead of inflation. Also, there's the fact we should want deflation just because that would be adorable and antiquated. I want to go back to the time where you could actually spend a farthing, literally a quarter of a penny. Maybe we could keep the decimal system, maybe not. I mean, base 12 is much easier for dividing things than base 10. But whether we have pounds, shillings and pence, or just pounds and pence, the fact is we need to bring back the quarter of a pence, which is to say a fourth of a pence, a fourthing, or a farthing. That's where the name comes from. And that would require getting to a point where a quarter of a penny could become a meaningful denomination of money to spend, as opposed to our current system where anything less than 5 pence really isn't worth considering, and to be honest, even 5 pence is a negligible amount of value. Really, we should be aiming to make a farthing like as valuable as a 10 pence is currently, which would mean making our currency 40 times more valuable than it currently is. Because it would be totally worth it. Can you imagine going to the shops to buy some sweets and the little lady behind the counter says, "That'll be 1 farthing, please, dear." And that's why we should pursue deflation. Vote for me. The problem is that if inflation encourages growth, then deflation would by extension stifle it. If the government is pursuing a policy to make the £10 in your wallet worth £400, you would be an absolute lunatic to spend that £10. And in fact, deflation does risk becoming a regressive tax rate, where the poorest people are forced to spend all of their money because they're living paycheck to paycheck. Meanwhile, the richest people can hoard all of their money and watch it become massively more valuable. Do you know what solves this problem? Do you know what the only thing is that would solve this problem? Can you guess it? That's right, an incredibly high tax rate. A high tax rate combined with deflation would mean that people's money becomes more valuable, but as it becomes more valuable, more of it is taken from them by the government. Now, I feel like this sounds a bit too simple, but I have heard it said that the government could simply solve inflation by investing huge amounts of money in foreign assets, thus allowing them to remove money from their own economy while still increasing their overall wealth. And if the government is pursuing a policy of radically renewing the UK's economy by temporarily taking a huge amount of control over it, then it doesn't matter if deflation drives down growth, because a lot of the economy would be being fueled by government spending from taxation rather than through consumer spending. And after a few years of that, the money in people's pockets would be worth a lot more, and the economy could return back to normal without the need for inflation to drive excessive amounts of consumerism. And I'm not sure, maybe there's some serious economic illiteracy in what I just said there, but as far as I can tell, I think everything I just said is possible. And I'll tell you what, it seems to me that the most possible version of that vision I just presented there can only be achieved through high taxes, so that's why I support them. Also, here's something I probably should have included in the Invest in Britain section, but I only just thought of it now, so I'm just going to throw it in here. I believe that the quality of public services should determine government revenue. See, right now people will be like, well, sure, the NHS is failing, but that's because there's no funds. But no, in my view, there should be a minimum standard for public services, a base expectation of quality. And if the funds available aren't enough to meet that standard, we don't compromise on the standards, we increase the revenue. And I think that should be non-negotiable. You don't want to pay high taxes? Well, Well, tough. We're not going to let our National Health Service decline in quality so much that people are dying due to lack of care. We're not going to let criminals out of prison because we can't afford to keep them there. We're not going to let children start missing out on basic education because there isn't enough money to hire teachers. The quality of services should determine the amount of government revenue. If the government needs more revenue to bring the services up to a certain standard, as far as I'm concerned, that's not a debate. It's not negotiable. Get the money. Realistically, increase taxes. The final thing I should acknowledge is I've left it ambiguous what exactly the government should be spending this money on. Obviously, I don't think the government just spending money on things is intrinsically good regardless of what it is. I've referred ambiguously to solving problems because I do think no matter what the solution is, it's going to require money. But I do have specific plans about how the economy should be organized, which would require a huge amount of money. And that's going to be the conclusion to this trilogy on my economic philosophy. Yeah, I know, I appreciate this video hasn't been long enough. It's actually insane how long this video is. I didn't realize how long it was until I found myself recording it. But the crazy thing is that when I was scripting it, I was actually behind schedule. So I was kind of like trying to write out the script as quickly as possible. And somehow, I guess, like I entered some sort of time vortex where even though I spent way less time on this than I do on my typical scripts, it somehow ended up being like way longer. I mentioned this video on my Discord and I just said, I'm working on a video about why I think we should pay higher taxes. And the first response I got was, why do you just randomly make these videos every now and then on the non-trans issue that are always guaranteed to get a massive number of dislikes? And I feel like at this point it's just like part of my brand. Like my brand is that I'm agenda critical, that's part of it. And the other part of it is that I will occasionally talk about other issues. And every single time I do, it will always get a huge number of dislikes and massively annoy my subscriber base. But you guys stick around anyway, which I do appreciate. Anyway, I'll wrap up really quickly, do all the algorithm things, check out like my other content if you're interested. I'm not really going to go through all of that. I was going to include a Patreon clip, but I'm not going to because I will be on holiday soon and I'll actually be away for 2 weeks. And when I'm away for those 2 weeks, I will not be doing a bonus Patreon video, and as such, I will not have a clip to show. And even though that's going to be like in the future, I figure what I'll do is, because this was a really long video, I won't show the clip here, and then I will show the clip at the end of one of the videos I upload when I'm on holiday, even though, yeah, there won't be a Patreon thing there. But you should still give on Patreon because, you know, there's lots of stuff to catch up on if you've not given up on Patreon, if you're not given on Patreon already. Anyway, bye.